What is love to you?
Maybe love is the possibility of all that is. I've been wrestling with, or playing with, and sitting with, and being with how we define love. I don't think something that's singular, ultimate, and all that is can necessarily be defined. And I know by saying those, using absolute terms to, in the same sentence of love, there is some level of definition there. But I think when we speak to love, and when we firstly speaking to it is secondary. Viscerally, it must be experienced through a subjective self.
And we're here with this beautiful human, Stef Sifandos, a relationship expert and coach, is really being able to share with our audience, your story, who you are and how you have built your empire and why you've been put on this planet.
As a kid, I never experienced being seen, being accepted, being loved, being understood for as I was. I constantly felt I had to be someone different to appease the people in my environment, namely my parents, to ensure that they felt okay. And so when we speak about defining love, part of that human definition or that relational definition really is a deeper acceptance for how a person is in that specific moment, whether it's in their constitution in a longer term capacity or in that moment.
If you were to give that one key, that one piece of advice to the listeners, that key that opens and unlocks whatever that is for them, what would that key, that piece of advice be? Welcome to the Queendom. And we're here with Keys to the Queendom. I'm super grateful and excited to be up at 2 a.m. for this beautiful human. Stef Sifandos, you are a relationship expert and coach. We're really grateful to have you here today. How are you, my friend?
I'm good. I'm only a relationship expert by default for making so many mistakes and continuing to make so many sometimes bad choices in relationship, but choosing to learn from them, ideally. Not all the time.
It's funny. I was a fitness coach and I became a business coach. And so I teach people in business the mistakes I made as a fitness coach. So I really reflect on that too.
Yep, I hear.
Legend, before we begin, I love to just ask you the question, what is love to you? What is love?
That is a tough question. I guess love is everything and nothing. Love is all there is, and love is the emptiness that's left when we're just with ourselves, or maybe love is the possibility of all that is. I've been wrestling with, or playing with, and sitting with, and being with how we define love, and I don't think something that's singular, ultimate, and all that is can necessarily be defined. And I know by saying those, using absolute terms to, in the same sentence of love, there is some level of definition there. But I think when we speak to love, and when we firstly speaking to it is secondary. It must be experienced viscerally. It must be experienced through a subjective self. And I always go back to what the Vedas would say, and that is that not so much about love, but around ultimate reality, and that is that we are the observers. So we're not the thing being observed. We're not the process of observation or the object, like the thing being observed, but we are the observer. And I think love is that it sits underneath, behind everything that is, and that drives us, including the stuff that's really uncomfortable. Because underneath that is this movement back to love, whatever that is.
You answered that so beautifully. And, I feel for the first time in my life, I'm in a beautiful relationship where love to me is the uncomfortable feeling of healing through the good, the bad, being loved unconditionally for all parts. But I know you have an amazing story. And, Keys to the Queendom is really being able to share with our audience, your story, who you are and how you have built your empire and why you've been put on this planet. So I'd love to hear more about you, Stef.
Yeah, I think you touched on something I'm very happy to share, but I think you touched on something that's really important. And what you touched on around unconditionality Maybe it's something that's a little different to that. And this feeds into my own story. Because as a kid, I never experienced being seen, being accepted, being loved, being understood for as I was. I constantly felt I had to be someone different to appease the people in my environment, namely my parents, to ensure that they felt okay. And so when we speak about defining love, part of that human definition or that relational definition really is a deeper acceptance for how a person is in that specific moment, whether it's in their constitution in a longer term capacity or in that moment. That doesn't mean that we are lax or loose on our boundaries, or that we take and receive punishment if a person is being abusive and we just say, well, we must accept all that they are. Not at all. But it's devoid of judgment. And for us to be deeply devoid of judgment and criticism and projection, we must do our own inner work, right? As a side note. But growing up, I never really experienced that level of unconditionality until a little bit later, which I felt it through my grandparents, but really as an adult, because as a kid, their love came with conditions as well. And they were beautiful. And honestly, if it wasn't for my maternal grandparents, I probably wouldn't be here. They were such a loving, safe space. But it still came with conditions, because my Italian grandparents, particularly my Italian grandmother, was, bless her, and I love her so deeply, very manipulative. And she would do whatever she could to ensure that me and my brother, her grandchildren, her only grandchildren, would be able to stay with her. And so that love, the giving, the interaction, it still came with conditions. And so I just felt very alone growing up. Couple that with volatility and violence and physical and emotional abuse from father and mother. That was really difficult. And then as we grew older, myself and my brother, I guess I suppressed a lot of my pain and repressed a lot of my pain. My brother did as well, but I did it in a way that, I excelled and was performance-based and validated through my external performance, whereas my brother went into very deep, dark recesses of his own psyche and hit drugs and became an addict and went that path. And I was suffering as well in darkness, but I was suffering in the silence. I wouldn't show it. It was just a very different way of coping with very similar circumstances growing up. And fast forward that, my brother removed himself from that environment and has been clean for a very long time, well over a decade, and we're very, very close now. But there was a lot of violence in our family between me and my brother as well, because of the things that he was bringing home, and so it was just a very chaotic environment growing up and witnessing very unhealthy examples of intimate relating and romantic partnership. Parents sleeping in separate beds, constantly arguing, physical violence between them, deep animosity, calling each other names, very rude and abrasive, impatient with each other. I didn't really have healthy examples of what it meant to be like to be in a relationship, to be married, to be just connected in a relationship. And honestly, most of my friends who also, ethnic Italian, Croatian, Portuguese, around where I grew up in Western Australia, their parents honestly were very similar. It's a very similar upbringing. And those cultural imprints stayed with me, yet I wanted to be in a relationship and had a sense that was really important to me, but I didn't really know how to be in a relationship. And I wanted to be the best version of myself, but I was so accustomed to wearing all these masks that I just wore masks in relationships as well. And so witnessing my parents growing up, I'll give you a direct example of a pattern that I adopted, was this, freedom being my greatest fear and greatest wound, but also my greatest value. And so being in an intimate relationship when there were preferences presented and agreements wanting to be made in the relationship, I felt restricted. I felt this sense of annihilation. This sense that my freedom was being taken away from me, but I wanted to be in the relationship. But then I just went to, well, I can maybe stay in the relationship and still have my freedom. And my freedom was, I'll just go and have sex with whoever I want, when I want, how I want, and do it, behind closed doors. In what someone doesn't know doesn't hurt them. And I witnessed some of that in my own family. My father was a gambling addict as well, and no doubt there were women that he would see and be with outside of his marriage. And so I just thought it was normal. I thought that was okay. Even though I felt guilt and shame, I, quickly stuffed that down as well because it was easy to do that. And got to a point where it became an obsession, it became an addiction, it became a compulsion, prostitution, using sex as validation, using intimacy as validation. But the reality is all I wanted and all most men want is intimacy, is to be seen for who they are, is to be held, is to be loved, is to be cared for, is to be acknowledged, respected, accepted. And it's a human construct to want those things, desire those things. And for the most part, not just men, but women as well, us as humans, we validate that, or we attempt to experience that through the physical act of sex because it's such a peak experience, and we associate orgasm with closeness. And so that was basically what I was doing until I got to a point, and I'll fast forward here and I'll pause in a moment. It got to a point where the partner that I was with at the time, she found out. I didn't even have the courage to tell her. I was close to having the courage to tell her, and she found out before I did, and we were together for a few years, and that became a catalyst for me. A lot of shame came up, a lot of repressed and suppressed childhood trauma came up, and for many different reasons in that moment many years ago, I just chose to deal with it and chose to not go back to the life that I was living because it was just breaking me, and it was breaking my spirit. It was breaking those around me. It wasn't fair. It was very dishonest. And it was just time to, irrespective of what it was like, it was just time to change. And I went down a very long, dark, painful path of self-discovery and shadow work, essentially, like really excavating the deep recesses of my mind and psyche and being and emotional self and the trauma that I experienced. And I surrounded myself with people that could support me, healers, spiritual guides, shamans, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. Like I worked with energy healers or body workers. I worked with anyone and everyone, and really committed to that. And again, went to some really, really painful places to not revisit that pain, but to actually give it an opportunity to be released because it had been trapped in my body. And the pleasure that I was seeking was attempting to flee from the pain that I was holding.
Steph, thank you so much for sharing that, and so many beautiful moments, similarities, if you don't mind me sharing as well. My father was a gambling addict too, cultural upbringing, and we spoke about it before, German and Portuguese, so a very interesting mix. And suppressed trauma based on what my mum used to always say, Tammy, don't show people what we're going through. So, I can really resonate with that too. And my beautiful brother going down the addiction behaviors, me going through the other parts, but finding other addictions along the way. So I really wanted to bring that forward. And again, really, really have so many questions, but I thought there was something you brought up on your Instagram, and that was where I feel like this beautiful question can sort of lead into what I really want to ask. And you said the wounds of childhood became the battle of adulthood. That's a beautiful thing to read, and it's just something that I've been reflecting on. And you've said so beautifully the different paths of healing you've gone through, and obviously where you are now. What do you feel right now, women and men, when it comes to understanding the wounds of their childhood? Like when they see that, or when they start to kind of get to that pinnacle moment, for you it was obviously in that relationship you were in, was that moment for you to make change? Do you feel like a lot of men and women are also going through this interesting path of understanding now that their childhood wounds are bring other battles that they face in adulthood? And how do you support that with what you do?
Queen, how often have you said, I spent my whole life studying, I've been to school my whole life, and I've actually learned nothing that teaches me the tools and strategies to build a successful business in the outside world. You've probably spent thousands of dollars on courses, or you've heard fake news from business gurus. Well, I'm here to give this incredible news to everyone here right now that this is Queen Stream University. Get out of debt and actually start making money in the online space, knowing and having the foundations to build a successful business. Now I'm talking because I have gone through the trenches. I have been a fitness coach, built my online business as a pro athlete, and now I am a business coach. You'll go from having absolutely no idea what your business is through, in the 8 weeks, learn the foundations of knowing what your purpose is, your vision and mission, and also understanding your business values with the execution to know what that business is. You'll also learn branding, social media, content strategy, marketing, and more importantly, how to sell. With Queenstream University, it'll cut out the bullshit and remove all the fluff and get you working specifically on your business so you can execute this in 8 weeks to get ready to launch. I wanted you to have something where you get to access something straight away, where you get to fast track your growth, as well as remove any doubt, any overwhelming sensation or stress, or the question that everyone seems to ask, where do I begin? With Queenstream University, you'll be able to build wealth, freedom, and at the end of the day, be an entrepreneur and be able to say, I have finally built my own thing, my own business. And I've stopped making money for someone else, and I'm now making money for my own empire. Queenstream University.
I think most of us don't make that connection, hence why it's very rarely visited and it's very rarely acknowledged within self. I can't tell you how many clients that I've been in personal transformation space for 23 years, coaching, consulting for 23 years, and I'm supporting people in this way for a long time, and a long time relative to my life and I guess human years, but I can't tell you how many people will just nonchalantly just speak about sexual abuse and bullying, which is something that I experienced a lot of as well growing up as a kid, and as if it's nothing, oh yeah, my father raped my mother in front of me, but they meant well, they're good, they're good people, we got a good relationship now. It's just this bypassing, and it's a protective strategy. It's not because they're arrogant or ignorant. It's a lot of pain to look at, and so many people disassociate from their developmental experiences, because so much of what we experience growing up, it shapes who we are as adults. It shapes the way we relate to ourselves, our self-worth, how we deal with trauma and conflict, what pleasures we inject into our lives in order to mitigate that pain. The greater the pain, the greater the pleasures required. We all have different tastes for what that looks like. Food and sex was it for me, food from a very young age, and food still is a crux for me. Food still is, I still emotionally lean into food to feel better about overwhelm or uncertainty or difficulty or whatever it may be, right? And yeah, I'm athletic and I'm fit and all those things, but even my, my training for a long time was, obsession around not so much how I looked. It was more about performance, and it still very much is but I enjoy it too. It's a very entrenched habit now, and the come from is different to what it was. But there's still elements of my come from that still come from, I would say, a wounded or unhealthy place, right? It's just a lot less now. And so it's not, I don't have to keep the wolf at bay. I can recognize that there's deeper levels of self-compassion and self-acceptance within myself. And this is a process, right? So, again, to come back to your question, I don't think most people make that connection. That's part of why I feel I'm here on this planet in the work that I do. And I'm very connected to the work I do, is to support people in seeing that connection and feeling safe enough to explore it, to release what's stuck so that their body feels free to move on to the next iteration, next version of themselves, because that's what I experience. And I know that's what so many of us experience. I've worked with thousands and thousands of people in this space where we all have the capacity to do that and be that when we feel safe enough in our bodies. And we can address the stuff that's been, shoved down into the bottom of the darkest places within self.
I want to touch on a little bit of shadow work, because I'm actually quite new to this space. But before I do, how is your relationship with your mum and dad now? I'm currently navigating through, still not speaking to my father, and I feel like my body's telling me there is an element very soon where I will probably reach out and reconnect. And I don't know if that's advice you give. Obviously, that's something I know I need to explore myself. But before we work through the shadow stuff so that the listeners can learn more about that, how is your relationship with your mum and dad, and did you forgive them?
So my relationship with both my parents now is healthy and it's stable, and there's that deeper level of acceptance and compassion and love. And do they still frustrate me? Abso-fucking-lutely. Definitely, for so many different reasons. And more than anything, though, there's probably more sadness. I don't want to say sympathy. Sometimes there's some sympathy, which isn't necessarily the healthiest thing, but empathy, compassion, frustration still exists, of course, but just sadness, especially for my dad and how he's lived his life and how he's living his life now, quite isolated. And but we're close. I'm close with my family, and I love them dearly. That was the first question. What was the other part of your question? Sorry.
I think it was forgiveness, and
yes,
I think for me it's just navigating through. Yeah.
Yeah. So the way I forgave my parents, and look, let's be honest, maybe that the frustration that I feel for them or with them at times now, maybe there's some other layers of forgiveness that need to take place. You know, I'm a new father. My baby girl's 18 months old. So, you know, she's teaching me a lot, showing me a lot, bringing up a lot. Just naturally through that process, because as human beings we reflect on familiarity. So I'm now reflecting as a son or as a child to my parents, and now as a parent I'm reflecting as, you know, who my parents were to me, and this new stuff's arising. And so maybe there's other layers of forgiveness. But when I went through a process of forgiving with both my parents, or multiple processes I should say, not just one and done, right? Multiple processes of forgiving with my parents, what I ended up realizing was it wasn't a cognitive or intellectual practice. It had to be very visceral. I had to feel before I can truly forgive. And then we can experience real freedom. And so it wasn't until I felt what was unfelt, what was suppressed, what was unseen within me, that I was able to really, really move through a genuine process of forgiveness. And so my invitation to you is not to necessarily utilize your parents as that catalyst for they'll, you know, if I go to them and express myself and be with what I need to be with, they accept that, or they receive that in the way that I want them to receive it, then I'll be able to forgive them. That may happen. Chances are it won't. And the risk that you run is by relying on others to do the forgiving for you, or to be in full acceptance or full receival of what you are giving, is that they won't, and you'll be deeply disappointed, bitterly disappointed, and will spiral you further into disconnect. And so the process needs to be, it's you know, forgiveness is an inside job, essentially. And so you're the one that lives with it. You're the one that needs to work through it. Now, as you begin to really release the layers of that, and there's processes and tools and practices over time, and space as well, because you want to create space from these practices for integration that allow you to be in a different relationship with the construct of your parent. In other words, what you really wanted them to be and what you needed them to be, and who they actually are, and marrying the two, or uniting the two in such a way that helps you release the pain that surrounds you with the relationship to your parents. And then when you show up differently to them because your expectations are less, because you're tending to that little girl within you, that part of your psyche that's really, really hurt and that really just needs love and attention and acceptance herself, and you start to work with that part of you and you start to release tension, feelings, etc., that are associated with those experiences, you show up differently to your parents. We're relational beings. And so the subtlety of your actions, the subtlety of your unconscious cues, and the way that you interact with them shifts, and it immediately allows them to be differently, whether they know it or not. It's irrelevant, but it allows them to be differently. So now you're less triggered by them, you're less reactive. Therefore, you'll delay your reactivity. Still may exist, but it's delayed, which what it does is rupture doesn't happen so quickly, which allows repair to take place. So your nervous system starts to feel safer with them. So then you spend a little more time with them, and maybe it's a few minutes, but then a few minutes over a few months, it keeps adding up. And that gives them an opportunity to see themselves differently through you and through the relationship. And all of a sudden things are changing between you. Now that may never happen, by the way. But more than likely that does happen. But irrespective, what does happen is that you're okay. And you didn't need them to be okay. Because part of our wound as kids is we need our parents to be okay. And so we forge and form this codependence. Now you can release the codependence. You become more interdependent, healthily dependent, but with yourself, because you're healing those parts that have been wounded.
So much is coming up, especially around... and I'll give you a little bit of context because I can't share too much about, I guess, what has happened with my father and I. And you're right, there is a level of, I've always wanted him to accept me for who I am, get him to be proud of who I am as an athlete, as a pro. competitor all those years. Society, though, would deem him as unhealthy, not safe. So there's a battle that I face where there's guilt and shame, knowing that I have forgiven him for what he's done. There's other layers to not just him being a gambling addict and he's gone to jail. And so there's a part of me that's wanting to still be in his life, and that's kind of what I'm sort of facing at the moment. So hearing everything that you've just said there, it's really solidifying in myself that you're right, it's a process. The healing journey, the forgiveness journey takes time. And I think this conversation is just adding more layers for me to reshift and reframe to see what's important for me. So I really appreciate that, Stef.
Well, can I say one thing to that you've just shared? I think is very important. That I maybe it's obvious to me, but it may not be obvious to others. And only because I'm just in this work so much. Your physical primary safety is of the utmost importance. And if there's ever a scenario or situation where you don't feel physically safe and your life is threatened, you must remove yourself from that environment and space. That's not the time to go into deeper emotional work or trauma release work. You have to get out of there and then regulate your nervous system and then deal with old stuff that is feeding into the current situation.
And it's so interesting you bring that up, absolutely, because it was an unsafe environment. It's been over 8 years now. So I feel like removing myself, being able to go through, I guess, on my own, the healing journey, and through therapy work, energetic work, so many things. Yeah, I think, as you said just then, it's sort of now where my central nervous is kind of at that point now where it's going through that next phase of forgiveness and healing. So I really appreciate you bringing that forward. For the listeners as well, and again, as I said before, shadow work is very new to me. And so I actually don't understand so much about it. For anyone that, if you were to explain that to someone, what is shadow work and how does that support anyone when it comes to relationship with self and building relationships as well?
There are many definitions of shadow work. One of them is shadow work is defined by the deliberate exploration, and maybe it's not deliberate sometimes, but ideally the deliberate exploration of as much of ourselves as possible. So the patterns, the habits, the ways that we think, the belief systems, the values that we hold, the emotions, the unpleasant, undesirable ways of being, like the anger that we have, or the impatience that we carry, or the abrasiveness, or the manipulative tendencies that we hold, whatever it may be, really deliberately exploring that, acknowledging that within ourselves, accepting that part of us, integrating it, and making healthy choices around how and who we want to be in our lives. In other words, not being completely controlled by the unconscious aspect of self, the entrenched patterns that were formed, protective strategies, defense mechanisms, psychological defense mechanisms that were formed during a period of our time of our life, during our developmental formative years, where we were very tender, very susceptible to information. It's unpacking all of that is in the dark recesses of our psychology, and learning to love all parts of ourselves is part of the process of shadow work. Learning to integrate these parts, make them whole, learning to regulate the nervous system when we're in a dysregulated state, learning more about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And it's less about intellectual knowledge, and it's more about being with. And also, by the way, may I say, the collective unconscious, as Carl Jung would express as well, that there are aspects of being human that reside within all of us. You know, I often say, if Hitler can do it, you can do it. If Jesus can do it, you can do it. I'm just using two prominent figures in our history, right? Because we have access to that now. But we get to choose what we bring to the world, right? And also, we get to choose to look at what are those dark parts in us that want to hurt others or that want to hurt ourselves. So that's shadow work. It's really exploring the unknown, making the unknown known, making the unseen seen, making the unconscious conscious as much as possible, and being deliberate with spending time with ourselves to unravel and unpack ourselves in meaningful ways.
So in relation to unraveling and unpacking ourselves, when you found the woman you're with now, your beautiful wife, how did that all come about with your beautiful intimacy, and advice for anyone listening when it comes to building or rebuilding intimacy again, when maybe they've gone through similar addictions to yourself, or even haven't had intimacy in a way where they felt safe in new relationships?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'll take the first one, what you just finished with. I'll address that first around not feeling safe in relationships. So I think one of the purposes of being in a relationship is to, or at least one of the byproducts of being in healthy relationships should be to feel safe, right? And it's okay to feel unsafe every now and then. And I don't mean physically unsafe. I'm talking about emotionally unsafe. As long as you have agreements in place and there's a genuine desire and willingness to repair, you end up, generally speaking, and usually over time at least, and maybe with some repetition, feeling safer in the relationship, in your own self. There's this deeper self-discovery that takes place. But if we're constantly feeling emotionally unsafe in relationship, like we're feeling maybe gaslighted, or we're feeling that the person is abrupt and volatile, I'm not sure we really should be in that relationship, or at least those issues should be addressed and worked through, right? Those issues should be addressed and worked through so that we can be in deeper harmony with ourselves and not make choices that are really not in our best interest, or not in the best interest of the relationship. So if you're ever feeling unsafe in relationship, it needs to be voiced, and then agreements need to be made around that. And that can be difficult. I get that level of confrontation can be really, really scary. And you want to be with a partner that can really receive that, even when they're in their shit, So that's really important. What was the first part of the question that you asked? Remind me again.
Yeah, unpacking and unraveling that you did, and obviously now being in a beautiful married, I'm assuming, with your wife.
Yeah.
How did you bring forward, I guess, or the unpacking and unraveling, and obviously integrating the work in this beautiful relationship you're in now?
So I've grown tremendously in this relationship in the last 5 years plus, tremendously. And when I met Christine, I'd been in a space where I was very blessed, very tough, but I'd done many years of deep work. So when I met Christine, I was just very honest with where I was. I was confident with who I was and what I'd moved through, not arrogant, but confident. And what I spoke to earlier about owning our shadows and owning the unpleasantries within ourselves and the undesirable and the stuff that we don't like, that we think is yucky or disgusting or ugly. I'd taken deeper level of ownership of that than I ever had before. So I brought that honesty, that level of honesty into the relationship. And then, of course, as spiritual arrogance has it, we both thought, we've done so much work, relationship's going to be a breeze. And then, honeymoon period was over very quickly for us, and the inner work began, and as it has it, right? So there's a new level of growth, a new level of honesty, a new level of shadow exploration, because now you're in a relationship where it brings up something else in you because that person's different, your dynamic's different, et cetera, right? New layers, same stuff, new layers, right? However, for me, it was this commitment, and for Christine, this commitment to continue to be honest with each other and continue to come back to love and come back to repair and come back to our truth. And that's not always easy, because sometimes we project or think or know that our truth will hurt someone. And not because we want to deliberately hurt them, but just because, we've changed and shit. And so how do you change together? Is that even possible? It is. And sometimes it's not. So for whatever reason, fortunately or unfortunately, where we are today, the changes that we're both experiencing still suit us and serve us, right? So we'll continue to explore each other in the container together. But if we're not honest with each other, and then we hold resentments towards each other, and we have these covert agreements or these unspoken agreements because we're just agreeing with something to just agree with it, and then we're going to hold resentment towards each other, and that will fester to anger and rage and self-sabotage and destroy the relationship and withholding of love and intimacy and doing things that hurt someone, the other, just because we want to feel a particular way, So coming back to honesty is really important, and coming back to self-love is really important as well, self-care.
Hey, beautiful kings and queens, are you right now in a space where you're ready to take action and build your business, yet you struggle where to begin? You're feeling stuck and overwhelmed with all the things you need to do when it comes to building a business. Build the business of your dreams in the online space and be in the arena of all the incredible, great humans out there that are building 7 to 8 figure businesses. Now, the foundations that I truly believe in that you are going to learn through this membership is sales, marketing, content creation, social media, money mindset, and of course, branding. Now, all of this will be accessible for you to be learning what is currently hot right now in the market and how you can create your own business and build a successful business in the online space. All you have to do right now is DM Empire in my Instagram or email myself and my team, and we will get the ball rolling so you can have your empire and start making moves in the online space.
I'll touch base on something that's coming up for me in a second, but I love the fact that you brought honesty. Jordan and I, we actually had a fight last night, believe it or not, and here you are. But in the moment of the fight we had, I felt unsafe, and this is the first relationship, and we've only been together for 1 year and 6 months. And probably the first relationship where from the very beginning there was truth spoken, there was honesty, but it was also this level of understanding. And it's interesting, I guess, when one person's at a different place when it comes to growth and healing, and then the other person meets you there. I think we're both sort of now navigating the different ways of, processes and healing. And I just wanted to bring that forward. Because I think anyone that's listening and maybe they're new in a relationship, or maybe they may have been in a relationship for a very long time and they're both now starting to understand that there's ways of working through a relationship, even though they've been told or have had these imprints in the past. What would be the first, I don't want to say the first piece of advice, but if one partner's at a different place and the other one is still learning to navigate through, I guess, the healing journey, how do you bring forward in a way where it doesn't feel like you're telling them this is what they need to do?
First, I think it's important to really have agreements in place when you're in connected, healthy spaces. So have those conversations when you're in connected, healthy spaces. So an agreement could be around conflict, right? So you may say, and you may use nonviolent communication as a framework of communication. So observation, feeling, need, and request. So you may say, look, my observation of you is when we're arguing or we're disagreeing about something, your energy gets really, really big and your tone changes and you raise your voice. And as a result of that, like the feeling, what I feel is I feel really scared. It reminds me of my father. I withdraw, I shut down, and then I go into stonewalling, which I know doesn't really work for you, and I feel really scared in my body. My need would be to feel safe when we're in conflict. And my request would be that if you feel really angry, can you take 5 minutes to go punch the boxing bag outside or scream into a pillow and then come back and try not to raise your voice too much with me? And it's not that I think you want to hurt me or you're going to hurt me. It's more just that what it does to my nervous system, it would feel really safe for me until I can start to regulate myself in a greater way. That's an example, right, of what that agreement would look like. And then the other part to that is like if both individuals are taking ownership of their own patterns and how those patterns don't necessarily serve the expansion of the relationship, they have to be responsible. You'll notice that, just a side note, you'll notice that I use words like should and have, and I do that very purposely, right? I do that, and language is really important, but I do that because this is a bit of a pet peeve in the industry that we're in, the space that we're in. The spiritual community likes to fucking bypass. We get to do this and we get to go to the toilet and we get to pay our bills. No, you fucking need to pay your bills. And you need to pay your bills because you have an idea of what you want your life to be. And if you don't, then your life won't be that way. Anyway, side note, just injecting a little humor into the space. So we do get to be responsible for our own growth. And that may look like you both have therapists, counselors, coaches, etc., that you work with. Maybe even couples, like a couples coach or something. And if you want to be in the relationship and you want to grow in the relationship, then you probably should do that. So that's the other part to it, is really, really taking responsibility for our own self-work and our own inner exploration, and then not bringing those projections and that shit into the relationship. And again, we're human; it's going to happen. But what are your agreements when it does happen, and how do you repair? Like, that's another part, another agreement. Like, how do we repair if it gets a little out of control, which it can? How do we repair in a way that's actually genuine? It's not just sweeping it under the rug or pretending to repair just to, be done with it, but like genuinely repair.
The agreements really resonate with me. I find that Jordan and I seem to make new ones whenever the new level of
don't make them when you're arguing.
That's
the thing.
Literally, right? Need to write this down. Walk away when Tam gets triggered around money. No, I really appreciate you talking about that. So I talk about, and this is again going into business mindset, because I think it's great to bring forward maybe a bit of similarities. But I mean, I always express to my listeners, followers, do it even if you're not ready, right? But in a context of a relationship, do you feel women and men should need to be ready before they jump into a relationship? And how do you know when you are?
It depends on the circumstances, and it's different for everyone. They're the two immediate answers, right? Sometimes it depends what philosophy or what approach you take to it. You need to be ready enough to be in the relationship. Otherwise, it probably won't work out, because you're going to be in and out. You're going to be non-committal, and that the lack of commitment will probably trigger your partner, which again, it's a perfect storm, right? Complementary wounds meeting each other, trauma trains clashing into each other. However, you want to be ready enough. You want to be clear that you want to be in a relationship, and you want to be clear that you want to pursue the evolution of this particular relationship with this particular person. You can have uncertainties, that's fine, but you have to be clear enough on those things. Yeah, that's what I'd say to that.
Yeah, I'm reflecting back on patterns and behaviors of when I've gone from relationship to relationship to relationship. And it was all, I guess it had everything to do with me not loving myself, not seeing the self-worth in myself until COVID hit. And that was my time of being in a studio apartment. I always talk about this with my followers, with 2 cats, a lot of personal development work, a lot of healing work. And a lot of owning my shit. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I'd love to talk. I've got 2 more questions in relation to sex. I don't know how I want to go about this, because, I mean, everyone has their views on what is healthy sex, what is healthy intimacy. And maybe because I remember watching on your Instagram that there is a huge percentage of men who haven't had sex at all. And I'm assuming that's got a lot to do with what they've been through by default and whatnot. And then there's the opposite spectrum, where people have a lot of sex to the point of addictions. What is healthy sex? And what are the things that you've obviously gone through to obviously work through the addictions you've had? And the difference between sex and intimacy. There's a lot of questions there, Steph. Hope you're ready for that.
The first part of the question, like what is healthy sex, it's not a quantifiable thing. It's like, if you're having sex, 3 times a week, then that is healthy. It's really more what the come from is. So what's your unseen, unconscious is the shadow work, right? And also what's your conscious, your very clear needs and desires for sex, and just taking ownership of that, right? And if you're not getting sex and you're making that mean that you're unworthy, probably something to look at. Probably not the healthiest place to come from. If you're not getting sex and you're getting frustrated and it's emotionally disrupting your equilibrium and you're dysregulated, maybe that's something to look at, all right? If you need sex to feel important enough and like life matters, then you may look at that. That's not to say that sex isn't important in a relationship. It absolutely is. And connected sex and exploratory sex as well, and having agreements and consent and fun, play, and all those things, and the mystery around sexual intimacy and intimacy as well is really important. With respect to my compulsions and my addictions, I had to really reform and shift my relationship to sexuality. And really what happened was when I did that inner child work, when I did that deeper healing work and that shadow work, and by the way, shadow work is something that we I don't want to say constantly do, but it comes in different stages of our lives. Even if we're just sitting in meditation or in prayer and we're being with and we're sitting with a difficult set of circumstances or a difficult relationship, that's essentially shadow work as well, as an example, right? But it wasn't really until I unpacked where my deep desires for sex was coming from, and my relationship to the feminine, my relationship to my own worthiness and my own body and my own sexuality and all that, was that I could shift and change my dependence, my hyper dependence on needing sex. That's when life really changed for me. I think there was one more question as well that you asked. What was that?
It's a good question. I think it's advice on finding how to rebuild that intimacy and sex when you've gone through either not having it for a really long time or you're new to having it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And look, any long-term relationship, I'd say most long-term relationships, and you can define long-term however you like, really. I guess there's some level of subjectivity to that. But any longer-term relationship is going to tell you that there are seasons and there are ebbs and flows in sexual intimacy. And so one of the ways that we come back to that is slow. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. I don't necessarily rush back into it, especially if there's some, trauma around it, little t trauma, big T trauma. In other words, one of you or both of you have, for whatever reason, you haven't had sex for some time and you both are now wanting to come back to that, but it's a little foreign for you. Come back gently, speak openly to it, be vulnerable, speak your fears. That's a form of intimacy and bonding. Like speak your fears around rejection, around can you help the other person feel pleasure? And if you don't, you're going to feel something about that. Like really be honest with each other, but you have to be safe enough in your relationship to do so. And that will make it a little easier to come back into sexual union. Don't necessarily start with penetration. Start with touching, start with kissing, start with caring. And maybe the next night it's something else. And there's still no penetration. And you build up slowly to that. Because trauma is too much, too soon, too fast. And if there's a traumatic attachment to not having sex, then you don't want to rush back into it just for the sake of doing so. Oh, well, we did it, tick a box, we had sex, great. But if there's an emptiness there and there's a lack of connection, that's going to be problematic for you.
Sorry, Steph, the connection just paused there. What was the last little bit you just said?
Oh, I have no idea.
I'm sure it was amazing.
I'm sure it was recorded.
2 more questions. I held my facial expression, so don't worry. Can you still, so 2 more questions before we wrap up. And again, I'm really grateful for having you on this show. To love yourself first, or can you learn to continuously to love yourself as you start a relationship? And both. I ask that because, great answer.
It's both. Because you love yourself enough.
Yeah.
You need to love yourself enough to be in the relationship and move forward in the relationship. And then you will deepen love for yourself if you're open to receive. In other words, if you feel worthy enough to receive in the relationship. And if the relationship is a healthy relationship and one that prioritizes growth of the individuals, the couple, and the relationship itself, then you will deepen into self-love and worthiness. And your partner will extract that from you, either knowingly or unknowingly. They will call you forward as a partner. But you have to have enough self-love and self-care and worthiness to know your value to actually say yes to the relationship. Otherwise, the relationship won't exist. And if you push it away, if you self-sabotage, if you become hyper-protective, if you don't acknowledge it, if you're fearful and you hold back and you withhold and you just hide, then you'll never be in the relationship and you'll never deepen self-love.
That was beautiful, my friend. And this is the one question I ask every amazing guest speaker that we have to close off such a beautiful, beautiful time together. If you were to give that one key, that one piece of advice to the listeners, that key that opens and unlocks whatever that is for them, what would that key, that piece of advice be?
Yeah, know that it's safe enough to be in your body, and that you may need someone else that knows they're safe enough to be in their body for you to realize that it's okay for you to be in your body.
Thank you so much, my friend, for being on Keys to the Queendom. Where can everyone find you, and what are you currently working on so that they can jump on in it too, which, let's be real, it might be me and my partner.
Fantastic. So a couple of different ways you can find me through social media at Stefanos Sifandos, and my website, stefanosifandos.com, and a couple of highlights with respect to what I'm doing in the world. My coaching, of course, I work with couples, men and women, and then Breathwork for the Feminine, which is a beautiful 3-hour monthly immersive. You can come live in Austin, in Texas, or it's live streamed, and every session is recorded as well. It's a beautiful unpacking and revealing and unraveling of self. And it's a safe space. There's a sisterhood there. It's a really beautiful opportunity to get into your body and have some deep realizations and even deep reprieve, So you can find me, you can find all the details on my website, stefanosifandos.com/feminine.
Thank you so much for being on Keys to the Queendom, and my beautiful kings and queens. This is your host, Tamara Meyer. I will see you all next week.